To what extent is vulnerability a good thing? People talk about letting your guard down, and I get that being open is nice, but being taken advantage of certainly isn't. Barriers are necessary to some extent, but if you just think about it practically, barriers can keep out the good as well as the bad. That's the problem with barriers. If you have a shop and you want to make sure that no merchandise gets stolen, very simple solution: keep the shutters down. Padlock them. Lock the place in. Don't have any staff as well. There's a risk there. Just keep all the stuff locked up really well. And we can see what the problem is there. You're going to have no customers as well as no theft. So there's a bit of an issue. If you go the other extreme and you just leave all the stock out and it's a free-for-all, well, you might also have more theft then than customers. That's not going to work for the opposite reason. So there's some balance to be found. And finding that balance can seem a bit scary, but it definitely is something that's necessary. So when it comes to having barriers, the question then is, what are some of our priorities? What are things that matter to us? Because if we switch the retail example for a social example, and we say that, okay, socially, I don't want to get hurt. Well, again, like the retail example, there's a simple solution there. Just don't connect with anybody. No relationships, no friendships. Don't even chat to somebody at the bus stop. Don't even make eye contact, because you might have some vague affection for them, and then you might be disappointed if they don't glance back or something like that. So this is the path of maximum barriers and complete isolation. So, I'm obviously exaggerating slightly, but only slightly. But you can see that the risks that come with that strategy are already, from the get-go, you've lost so much that it probably isn't a sustainable strategy. So there's a bit of a balancing act to be found there. So within establishing your values, if there's something that you don't care about, well, then it probably doesn't matter. You can have barriers up there if you want, because that doesn't need to be part of your life if it's not one of your values or your priorities. But within areas such as creativity, relationships, experiencing the world, just the kind of things that we all need to some extent as part of our day-to-day health. The other thing to appreciate there is that our barrier systems are not all or nothing. They can be much more contextual. So there is such a thing as the right time and the right place to let down the barriers. And most people do this even in their homes. If you have a front gate, you might close it in the evening or at night, but you might have it open in the morning when a neighbor drops over, things like that. You're going to do this anytime you park a car. You kind of instinctively know that sometimes there's a wrong place to park a car, or sometimes there's at least a better place to park a car. So again, you're not being too binary about it. You aren't saying, well, I'm not going to leave my driveway at all in my car, because what's the point in having a car then? But nor are you just going and finding the most dodgy industrial estate somewhere that you can find and parking there and leaving the doors open. So there's this sense of kind of finding that balance somewhere in the middle. And the other thing then, as well as context, is reciprocation and kind of an earning of trust over time as well. Because the balance to be struck and the advantage of the vulnerability is, what the vulnerability is, I suppose, by definition, is a kind of a lowering of barriers. And the advantage of lowering those barriers is it allows other people to connect with us. It allows other people to maybe see areas where we have need and to support us, to maybe give us advice, to help us. And even if, when we lower those barriers, we find that it doesn't go so well or it's a bit uncomfortable, arguably, as long as it's not too extreme, arguably if it's to the right degree, that's still rather useful. Because it's like, imagine if you're a student and you're doing a course and you're afraid to ever submit an essay to the teacher because you don't want to be vulnerable to show your work to the teacher. And of course, the problem with that then is if your work is great, you won't get that feedback. So you can't feel satisfied in knowing that. And if your work could be improved, you're not going to get that feedback either. So there's a real loss in that. But again, context. What you're not doing is just showing your work to anyone. Firstly, they're a teacher. They're in a course and you've consensually chosen to enroll in that course. And ideally, not always the case, but ideally you have enough of a relationship with that teacher as well that they kind of get where you're coming from. There's a bit of an ongoing process there. So they know that even if you don't perfectly articulate yourself in a given moment, they kind of get the gist of what you meant, and they're able to help you maybe in expressing that in that particular example. So that's, I think, a really useful way of thinking about it. So rather than think of being vulnerable or not being vulnerable, you can say, well, absolutely, dropping those barriers really stands to benefit me in certain situations. But then the question becomes, what are those situations? So, as is typically the case with these things, experimentation, good old scientific method, is often the best way to find out what those situations are, where those moments are. And you don't have to do these big Indiana Jones risky scenarios where you just, drop all boundaries and go for it. It can be in little ways. It could be just with somebody who you have a reasonable relationship with. Maybe ask their opinion on something. Hey, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think of that? So that can be a very endearing thing when somebody looks at you, when they say something about themselves, but they invite your perspective. So that can be a really useful thing socially. It can help the other person feel important, and ultimately you gain from that because you get a perspective. Now, it's not that you need to necessarily do everything that they say. It's not that you need to devalue their perspective even if you disagree with it, but you can understand their perspective, but you can also recognize there might be 10 or 20 other perspectives. You can maybe ask the same question to other people and gather that information and then put them all together and see what you got. So something like that can be rather useful. So if you're practicing that vulnerability in that way, then you're going to find for yourself what works. And you will probably get it a bit wrong, but again, because you're not doing anything too massive or too crazy, it's not going to matter terribly. You're not going to get it too terribly wrong. You might feel a little bit vulnerable. But again, that's the point. And that's nice, because that means you're tapping into something real. We assume that uncomfortable feelings are bad. Whoever said that? Uncomfortable feelings are bad. Sometimes that's the problem. We're trying so hard to not feel uncomfortable that we make ourselves feel substantially more uncomfortable. And it's like kind of pulling off the bandage sometimes. If you're actually just torturing yourself over hours rather than just doing it, it can be more of a problem. So again, I'm not suggesting that you go looking for problems here, but finding that balance of expression with other people, which is a typical area that vulnerability comes up, although it can come up in non-social ways as well. There can be the vulnerability of just recognizing certain aspects of your life and facing them, the vulnerability of addressing certain challenges or difficulties that are there. All of these involve a kind of a self-honesty, I suppose, in that moment, but it's a really powerful and really useful thing. It's a massive topic area, so you probably can never define it fully in one sitting. But if you have this idea of the barriers and you're thinking of managing them as a verb, in other words, we don't just have them closed or open, but it's more the sense of, well, to what extent should I be open and honest with the environment? And what degree do I need to, maybe stop and maybe this isn't the right moment? And you practice a little bit of each. And then, like learning to walk or learning to dance, it's amazing how fluid you can be in knowing the right moment for things. But imagine learning to walk or learning to dance without ever walking or dancing. You need a bit of vulnerability to learn when to do it and when not to do it. Takes a little bit of practice. You may wobble a bit, but you're probably going to gain much more than you're going to lose. It's very beneficial. All right, over in the comments, Patricia says, hey, and Bridget says, well said regarding the barriers. Yeah, it's an important topic area. It really is. And like so many of these things, the problem is kind of the invisibility of it, I think. Because we don't tend to necessarily think about the barriers or visualize them as barriers too much. We have these feelings which maybe we pull back from. Again, it's not that that's a bad thing. It can be well worth pulling back. Sometimes we need to actually put up more barriers, in certain situations. Being good at saying no, being good at holding back, being good at retreating. But then maybe in other situations we need to push forward or open up a good bit more. So it's how can you even put it into words? It's a hard thing to put into words. But like language, how do we learn to speak? How do we know what word to say when? It's incredible. You couldn't do it consciously and intellectually if you tried. But as you practice it, somehow we figure it out. Kids, you can't stop them talking, so we're able to do it. If you found this valuable, do like, subscribe, and share. And what's your experience? Do you have any questions or topic suggestions? You can contribute in the comments, on social media using hashtag bodymindself, or on jfl.com.